All right. Hi, everybody. This is Kubernetes production readiness review team meeting for September 4th. And I guess we said it before we started recording, but we'll work it while welcoming Matt Bailey here, who's a Google SRE. He's going to shadow. Want to say hi? For all the people who want recording. Okay, awesome. So let me pull up the agenda. I have it up already. Share it. So, sorry, I have a new machine because my other one fried, and this one's a Mac, and it's like making me do all of these. All right, somebody else has to share because I would have to quit Chrome in order to share it. Or you can just open it up yourself. It is right. It's here. There's only 2 items on it. The last I looked. All right. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was the schedule. So the schedule is, I think, not 100% finalized because that'll happen by the end of next week, but it's basically finalized. I think we can probably assume that these 2 dates are not likely to shift, which is the PRR freeze, which will be October 3rd, and the enhancements freeze on October 10th. Those are in Pacific time. So what that is, Matt, as a newcomer, so we asked, the PRR freeze is a soft freeze where we ask people to have their designs ready for production readiness review a week before the close of design freeze. Otherwise, we don't guarantee them that we'll get to it. And if we don't get to it, then it might not make the release. Realistically, I shouldn't say it on the recording, but realistically, 80% of the people don't make the PRR freeze, but they do try. They do try, and we maybe get a review or two in on most things before that. But so it will be that week of before the 10th. That week will be intense. Up until then, it tends to be relatively low key. Like basically, there's about a 3-week period where there's a lot of activity, and the last week is super intense. And everybody else can agree or disagree with me, but this is my experience. And then it slows down. So we have the policies pretty well documented. I don't know if you've read through those. They will look familiar to you, many of them, but they've been added on to over the years beyond what we what we do internally. And so this meeting, we try to meet every 2 weeks, and we go over kind of any questions people have. Most things happen on the Slack channel because 2 weeks isn't enough, right? If most of the activities in a 3-week period, 2 weeks cadence isn't really enough. But then we'll do a post-mortem afterward, and typically update the process a little bit each cycle. That's kind of how we did it. So as far as shadowing, one of the things we've done in the past is, and this is your first cycle, I don't know if we want to do it this way for you, but it's up to you how comfortable you are. But usually we have the shadows actually do the reviews. We do like a reverse shadow, right? Where it's like you do a first cut, and then the approver comes in. Now that usually is somebody who's sat through and watched a few of them too. So, but so we'll see how it goes. And I assume you've got your GitHub ID and everything's all set up.
Yeah. I don't think I'm joined to any of the groups, but yeah, my GitHub's all set up.
Yeah, you shouldn't. You don't. Anybody can review. You don't need to be like in the queue.org or anything to review, and that's how you'll build up the contributions to be able to join the org eventually. Things like that.
Got it. Okay. Cool.
So Han, did you want to say anything, or Matcha, anybody? Like, we have. Let me bring up my. We should put in a sign up if you're on the. I put the agenda there. If you add yourself under the shadows, everybody who's shadowing, this cycle, that would be super helpful.
I mean, maybe new shadowers should shadow a reverse shadower,
Sure, that sounds great to me.
and then you can kind of staircase up, yeah, or something like that.
Yeah, that's a great idea, Han.
Mostly because you want to get you want it on the first iteration of the review and not the second, right? When you
Right.
don't have any inputs. So that's the only reason why I suggested.
Okay, so let me. So
I drop my GitHub.
perfect. Thank you. So I don't have any other specific topics. Han, I think you've been working with Matt to kind of go through the process. Did you want to, did you guys have any questions or anything that you wanted to discuss, or mostly just making
Do we
sure?
have a compilation of lists of the docs that people should read prior to PRR? Like I know that we have the API standards, and there's the one or two docs I think that are pretty important, like changing an API, whatever. You know the one I'm referring to.
Yeah. There's API changes. There's the API conventions. That's not as critical because the API reviewers do most of that work. But there's the KEP itself. You want to read the template. And in the template, there's a bunch of questions, and many of those questions actually have links out to related either examples of how, like the right way to do it, or examples of good ways to answer this question, or context for that question. They don't all have that, but a number of them do. And let me just pull up in enhancements.
The other important thing that I remember pointing out people in the past, I was pointed, have a look at the becoming an approver. So basically, to earn the credit, you basically have to check all the boxes that are explicitly called out in the link that I just shared.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was looking for the links. Okay, here's one too.
So it's probably good to have a look at it, and your past reviews, your current reviews, and make sure that you fill in all the boxes and that you cover various stages of transition between alpha, beta, and all the way to stable. If I remember correctly, there are specific requirements with regards to SKU coordination, the multiple components, interactions. Ideally, you want to do not only your primary domain, but something outside of your primary domain. So you're going to be basically have a look and feel of everything within the cube so that we can shuffle people and you have or you gain slowly experience across the entire cube.
Okay, cool. Sounds good. I'll start reading through. I read some of this before, but didn't go many links out. So I'll dive into this again a little bit more as well and look at some other PRR docs that have been done in the past as well.
Awesome. Yeah. That production readiness that Matcha put in is exactly like that's the main kind of overview of the process. I guess I would ask, since most of the other shadows have been involved with this for a few cycles, like we sometimes lose track of whether we present enough context when people come in. So, any improvements to kind of these onboarding or any additional onboarding type of documents would be super helpful. Like that list of here's what you should be familiar with across Kubernetes. If there's a ton of like things like you can read that API changes document and it's probably 40 pages or something ridiculous, right? Like at some point you're not going to remember all that stuff, but like just familiarizing yourself with it, and maybe we can come up with some sort of a concise onboarding doc. That would be great.
Yeah.
Well, for that
Okay.
one, we do also actually have that the API approvers will approve the API changes. So you don't have to catch everything from that doc in PRR.
A lot of what we focus on is like what's going to happen during the upgrade, and a lot of times that's like interactions between components, right? So there's things that run on the node, and then there's the control plane, and what happens if one feature gate is off? What happens? The typical we always have to make people explain, and they never explain is like what happens when you turn the feature off and then you turn it back on, like with the stale data, like those are all in that API changes doc, but just like we just want people to sort of be very explicit and make sure they made tests for it and things like that. The other thing I've seen before is sometimes, like when we were doing the IPv6 stuff, it was like if you enable this, like all of a sudden you've got a service with 8,000 endpoints. All of a sudden you're going to create 8,000 new endpoints, right? Like there's going to be a massive impact, and if you've got 100 of those services, you're talking a tremendous amount of processing that happens when you do this upgrade, and like how do you communicate that to the user, what's going on, and what are your mitigations? Those are kind of the things that people don't always think about, is that during those migrations.
Yeah, hedging it against amplification attacks on our own selves.
Exactly.
I've linked a couple docs, which are, I think, kind of important for PR, like the API changes in
in the
SIG
agenda rather than just in the chat, and that way,
yeah.
who's coming in later will see them.
Let me get version skew as well. There we go. One thing that helped me when I was getting started was making sure that the answers to the questions read well to an audience that is like a normal cluster administrator on the internet that is facing a problem right now and is trying to like worm their way out of it. Like they found this doc, it tells them it should tell them what to do. Like, how do I move forward? What metrics should I look at? How should I get out of this problem?
Yes,
it makes it a little higher bar than just like, oh, it makes sense to me. I understand now. I'm good. It's like, no, make it make sense to that audience.
Right. It shouldn't just be useful for the people who wrote the feature. Like, it's got to be useful for other people. And along those lines, we also some of the common things we tend to have to poke people around is like, oh, how do you tell if this thing's working? Oh, you just run this command. And it's like, but, I have, 20,000 clusters. I'm not going to run this command against 20,000 clusters, right? Like, you need a metric, right? So those are things probably that are very salient in your world, right? But it's very common for developers who are focused on delivering some functionality they're thinking about one user, to make those kind of oversights. So that's
Right.
We're just here to poke them and remind them to.
Not everyone exists in the test harness. Yeah.
Yeah. Like a really bad answer would be like, there's a status field that can help you. A better answer might be like, this specific status field can help you. And a really good answer would be like, you can run this kube state metrics thing and it will tell you the answer. And here's the actual command you run.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Examples, concrete examples. Yeah.
Okay, well, awesome. Exciting to get some new faces here. And anything else folks want to talk about today?
I'm excited to be here. It's great.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Well, the beta thing is going to have some repercussions to PRR, I imagine. So quite relevant, and probably people want to attend that meeting tomorrow.
Yeah, one of my immediate thoughts is that we might want to start moving more criteria away from GA and into alpha and beta stages. Like GA should be like, it's done, and we're just waiting to make sure that we're really happy with it, not like there's still work to do.
So when we first introduced this process, it was a new process, and people we're already like, it's so hard to get a feature in, right? And so there's some resistance to a new process. So we were kind of careful to try to minimize the likelihood of blocking people, So in that sense, there are probably things that right now are set, you need this for GA. I don't know, do we block beta on some of those things that we're now blocking GA on? I guess that's from what you're saying, Joe. Like, is that?
Yeah, I empathize with the contributor dilemma. Like, we're going to be asking more from them. And so we've kind of like tried to divide the pain into 3 buckets.
Exactly.
And now we're going to say, well, there's really only 2 buckets. So I don't know.
But if that's true, if there's only 2 buckets, they get the advantage of there's only 2 buckets, cycle wise, and they get the disadvantage of that means you got to do everything in 2 buckets.
Yeah. I kind of am willing to take the hit, but I understand that other people might have different perspectives. Another way to look at it is for things that go on by default, you kind of can get off the hook on the 3rd bucket by just getting it to beta, and now it's the community's problem, right? Because it's an on by default feature, and somebody's going to have to take care of it. It's now part of Kubernetes. So we would be shifting a little more burden to developers to actually get the whole thing done before it becomes the community's problem.
Yeah, no, that's a great point.
Yeah. I wasn't going to raise it yet, but kind of as a follow-up to that conversation, I think that we need to discuss more here how we make sure that the follow-through really happens. Like, you have to say, oh yeah, added tests and stuff. But I don't think that we have super tight checking right now between release and PRR and so on, that if you shipped a feature that it's actually getting covered in CI, preferably release blocking, like maybe have a unit test or something. But we have some other features that doesn't really work. Like a vented plague comes to mind, where they wound up going to beta with it default off, and if you turned it on, the cluster didn't even come up healthy. Like, that should not be happening for beta, even if we don't change the bucket. It's really not at beta at that point. So somewhere, I think the gap isn't that PRR asks you to do the right things. It's that we maybe don't have quite enough verification. I'm not sure if PRR should be on the hook for that, but I think somewhere in the project we need that. We used to kind of do this by the release team. If you wanted to ship a feature that before PRR, the release team would kind of push back on whether or not you could announce your feature, or if they were going to revert it because it wasn't covered. I think we're mostly asking you to kind of write it in the PRR doc right now, but I've seen that's not necessarily resulting in sufficient coverage.
So yeah, PRR is not in. I don't think we have the
bandwidth to be able to read every single PR. Yeah, that would be insane.
Yeah. So the goal of PRR was like, or the core principle was, we trust our contributors. We're here to help them do the right thing when they either don't know what the right thing is, or they forget to do the right thing, or or they need more guidance to do the right thing. But we trust that they will do the right thing when they know what that is. And we aren't going to go back and verify.
Well,
but just a second, man. But I hear what you're saying, that it doesn't have to be this group, right? It could be the broader thing. The intent was that it's kind of on the SIG leads who do the actual approval of the actual code, that it should, meet the criteria that we set. If that's not happening, then yeah, maybe we need to figure out some better feedback loop. I'm not sure.
It's hard to coordinate consistency on this sort of thing, but I think, like, for example, one approach might be communicating to the release team, hey, these features are going to beta. Can you make sure that they wind up having like release blocking CI or something along those lines? Like, I think we have enough room.
It sounds like that used to be part of the release process and isn't anymore, and it's maybe gotten lost.
GA, because we didn't have any other group like PRR, so the release team used to kind of say like, whoa, you can't be announcing something to GA this release that we don't even have CI for. Today, I think it's just sort of like you tell us like what the plan is, and then we're hoping that the code review approvers are catching it. But there's gaps between that. I don't think that process is working for getting people to a point where they have.
The team has a series of checkboxes for every feature, and we're one of the check boxes, but they have like, a dozen of them. Like,
Yeah.
it sounds like this should be there, like CI is in place for beta features, CI is in place, something like that. Like, um,
Well, I also think that the state of what we really need is going to be driven by what changes we make to the buckets. But
mhm.
like if we really collapse it into 2 buckets, then I think that this is a lot more interesting versus right now. If you're shipping something to beta, it maybe isn't quite as big of a deal. But if we're really just saying there's preview and there's release or something along those lines, then I think there's a higher need to make sure that the
Or
actually landed and that it's actually that signal is, you can't just have tests, they have to actually be part of the releasing. Although like it's not useful if you wrote a test and it's not actually blocking the release if it's going to be on by default.
Yeah.
what if we made SIG approvers shadow at least one PRR cycle? Then we distribute the knowledge across SIGs. It can't hurt. The overall like time to shadow is actually pretty condensed, right? It really occurs around cat freeze. It's only so
That's
I think
exactly
it's
when
like
they're also under the most pressure to get a bunch of approvals out. I think that's going to be. So I think that SIG leads. I don't think that SIG leads are unfamiliar with PR because they're on the receiving end of that, right? Like, typically the people. My contention is that typically the people who are the SIG leads also are involved in writing and or shepherding caps through the process, and so they're going to be involved in those reviews on the other side of it at the very least. So I don't think it's that they don't have familiarity with the process. I think Ben's point is there's maybe not follow through on that CI is there, which isn't necessarily even like,
it's not just CI. I mean, it's like the beta that was disabled by default, right?
Yeah.
Like
Well, that was
that's not
because they
that's not a
said,
CI. Yeah.
well, it was linked because they're like, well, we know we don't have enough tests yet and we're going to do it later. Like that's, we probably just should not be allowing that. But then separately, I think there's a certain level of like, even if we don't have a group like release management or release CI signal or something monitor this, just kind of communicating expectations. We really hammer on you are supposed to have certain tests and coverage and so on. But I don't think we actually wrote anywhere and it should become at least release informing or release blocking or something. And there's a set, we have like a set of requirements for what it means to promote something there if it's more than just like a trivial test case addition. And like that's documented, but those are disconnected and not being considered. So you could wind up with something where even if they write the tests and they run them somewhere, but they could be failing for all we know because no one is actually monitoring this for the release. And right now we do have that bandwidth for if you go through the process to have release like monitor your tests, like they will, you have to meet a certain like quality bar first. It's kind of similar. We have like a set of expectations for you must have demonstrated that this is like sufficiently reliable and runs within a reasonable amount of time, and then we can start like blocking the release on it, and then they will chase down those failures before it releases. But instead right now we have like the one where because it didn't have CI, it just was off by default data. That's weird. So somewhere in the midst of this, I think there's a room to spell out a little bit more expectation for what it means to be like following through on the checklist for getting that coverage and stuff.
yeah. So I'm trying to think about like what we do for conformance, right? Like, for all GA features, you have to have conformance tests, and that is one of the release team's checklist, right? They verify you can't go to GA, you can't promote to GA if you don't have this. Like, we need that same thing for each phase, and I think there is to some extent, but maybe as you're saying, it's incomplete or there's lack of follow through. So I think this is part of the. I don't I'm not like trying to be like, oh, I don't want to do it here, but I do think it makes more sense as part of the release team's process.
We do have the conformance test static analysis pipeline. We also have FeatureGate static analysis now. I wonder if we can bolt on top of the FeatureGate static analysis some sort of annotation that occurs for integration tests or whatever
like
that are mandated. Yeah, that aligns. The beta has a corresponding test, right? Like,
put it in the tooling. Yeah,
yeah, exactly.
Well,
It
I
seems
think
like to me that the default on for beta is being used as an escape hatch for a more recent level of distrust of the or lack of confidence in the feature, rather than what it seems like it's the original intention of having that changeable for a beta. It seems to be implied that it's really only for circumstances where there's a fundamental incompatibility or requirement that not everyone's going to meet. So I think maybe if you have in PRR something to do with why something would be on or off by default, that would be something you can review without having to look at the code.
And we do have some features that are off by default and turned on, like optionally turned on, right? Like even GA ones we have default.
Right, but they're not off by default because you don't have confidence in the feature. They're off by default because of a incompatibility or requirement that not everyone's going to have.
Yeah, I think there was like a networking one that was defaulted off that you need to turn on.
Yeah, there's even an example in the feature gates for the CSI driver.
Yeah. Yeah. There you go.
I think the conformance test for GA is an example of like a successful approach to this, where there's like a checklist, and I think we have done a pretty good job making sure that you're doing that. And if it's a conformance test, we know it's running, but like alpha beta is looser. It makes sense that alpha is loose. I think the direction we're trending is that it's less acceptable that beta isn't as stringent for this. Like maybe it's not a conformance test yet, but it should be something like comparable-ish, where you're getting to the place where it could be promoted to conformance once it's GA.
Well,
And it should be running
if
somewhere.
we move into two buckets, it may end up being a conformance test anyway. But yeah, also we'll see. Or almost.
That's probably another conversation, because the conformance group might not want you to require that beta features are like locked on. And conformance tests have to pass always unconditionally.
No, that's not really true. You have to be able to create a cluster that can pass conformance tests. They don't have to. There's lots of things you can do to configure the cluster so they won't pass conformance.
Sorry, I mean that like the test itself is not allowed to be conditional. The cluster configuration can be, but like it might be controversial to say like you're required to have this on. I think there are a couple of vendors that don't necessarily turn on beta and might not like that. I think we'd have to have that conversation, but I think that you should have to have something that it's a similar bar where like this is promotable to a conformance test once the feature is GA, and
I think
a conformance test it's running in release blocking CI.
I think that the last discussion I saw was like, oh, we would move to where there was some, I mean, we haven't picked yet, right? But if we moved only two, where it's preview and then GA, like, and then the last thing is just locked to GA, like locked on, right? GA with rollback and locked on. And so what I'm saying is that what now it's called beta would become GA with rollback. So since if it becomes
it's a semantic change.
Yeah.
That was Wojciech's point. That was Wojciech's point, right?
Then it needs conformance, right? So that was more my point, Ben, than that.
Oh yeah. Like I said, I think that we'll have a better idea like what specific solution makes sense once we know the changes coming to that. But I wanted to see that this is something to think about. Like we have the people writing down what is supposed to happen in PR, but there's only a few places where somebody actually checks that like what we said was supposed to happen happened.
Correct. Yeah. Almost nowhere. Yeah. Okay.
But like the conformance tests we do, and I think that's a pretty important one. I think we might need to tighten that up a little bit.
Okay, great point. Yeah. All right. Well, hopefully I'll see all of you tomorrow on this, and we'll have a discussion with the broader audience on this idea. It's not an easy decision, honestly. I mean, I think for years I've argued, kind of aligned with Tim, that we should only have two, but I do see arguments both ways. So we'll see. All right. Anything else to discuss?
It was a lively PRR today, so I enjoyed it.
Good. All right. Well, see y'all in 2 weeks and on Slack before that, I'm sure. Thanks all.
Yeah.
See ya.